Hi, my name is Sanford Jacoby, and I'm a professor of Human Resources and Organization Behavior at the Anderson School. With me today is Emily Nason, who is a PhD student in the HROB program. Emily and I worked on a research project together for the last couple of years. It's a study of human resource executives in Japan and the United States. But it gets at larger issues to do with differences in corporate governance and business strategy in Japanese and U.S. corporations. There's actually a big debate these days about differences in various kinds of capitalism. The kind of capitalism we have here in the United States, the kind you find in Europe, and what exists in Asia, and in particular in Japan. A lot of the debate is very theoretical. There isn't a lot of empirical research. And Emily and I decided that one way to get a handle on this debate was to do some empirical research. We wanted to look at the question of how different are U.S. and Japanese business corporations in the way that they organize the employment relationship, the way they manage it through their human resource executives, and how those things are linked to corporate governance systems. And in addition to looking at differences between Japan and the United States, we also wanted to see whether Japan and the United States were becoming more similar. That's to say, whether they were converging in the kinds of business systems that they have. And our starting point for this research was the observation that in Japanese companies, and here we're talking about large Japanese companies and large U.S. companies, the kinds of companies that are in the Fortune 500. In large Japanese companies, the senior human resource executive is a very powerful individual inside the corporation, and the human resource function at headquarters is considered a very important high-status department. But in U.S. corporations, typically that's not the case. Typically, the senior HR executive is not regarded as a very powerful member of the senior executive team, and the human resource function is not regarded as one of the powerhouse functions. We wanted to see if that was changing, whether the U.S. human resource function was becoming more powerful, and what implications that might have for the employment relationship. And we also wanted to see whether there were changes going on in Japan. For example, was the employment relationship there becoming more market-oriented, and what implications might that have for the human resource executive? The other way we wanted to get into this was by looking at corporate governance. Here in the United States, it's well known that our corporate governance system is what's called a shareholder value or shareholder value model of corporate governance. And the idea is that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize value for shareholders. That may seem intuitively obvious way to run the corporation, but many Japanese companies historically have done things differently. And their view is what you might call a stakeholder approach, where shareholders are seen as one stakeholder in the enterprise, along with employees, and customers, and suppliers. And the job of senior management is to balance the interests of these different stakeholders. As a result, in Japanese companies, because employees are viewed as stakeholders, the human resource executive is a relatively high-power, high-status individual. The CFO, the financial person, is not as powerful as in the United States. In the U.S., with the shareholder value model, employees are typically viewed as commodities to be bought and sold, not as assets. And it is the finance function in the CFO who's quite powerful, HR less so. So these were some of the issues we were thinking about when we designed our research project. How could we actually operationalize some of these concepts to see how different are U.S. and Japanese companies really? And are they moving towards each other, or are they pretty much staying on separate tracks? Emily, maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about some of the things we did in our research and what we found.
As Sandy said, so we started out with the idea that there are different ideal types of corporate organization in the United States and Japan. So in U.S., we have pretty much a shareholder model where in terms of corporate governance, in terms of HR strategy, executive values and employment outcomes is more shareholder focused. Whereas in Japan, we have a stakeholder model. So what is very interesting is that we try to see, instead of just looking at whether there's persisting differences on these variables in the two countries, we are able to actually use structural analysis to see how these variables are all related together structurally. And we actually find very interesting results in terms of we find both evidence for convergence and some persisting differences.
So we had both historical data that would allow us to see what was happening inside each country over time, as well as data that shows us what the countries look like currently today. And when we look at the historical data, we do see that Japan is becoming a little bit more like the United States in that the employment relationship is becoming more market-oriented, shareholders are becoming more important in corporate governance. One interesting thing we observed that we didn't expect to see was that some U.S. companies actually were moving in a kind of Japanese direction, tending to treat employees more as assets, elevating the importance of the HR function. So it wasn't only that we have seen in our data movement of Japan towards the United States, we also saw some U.S. companies moving in a Japanese direction. At the same time, though, we still see quite striking differences in many areas between Japan and the United States. The HR function in Japan continues to be much more powerful than the HR function in the United States. Conversely, the finance function is much more powerful in the United States than it is in Japan. We also see continuing differences in the importance that, or the way that companies think about employees, a more commodity-oriented approach in the United States, a more asset-oriented approach in Japan. Did I leave anything out, Emily?
Well, I think another thing that is very interesting is that in the U.S. we find that although we find the emerging Japanese model, so the coexistence of both stakeholder and shareholder model, in the U.S. The stakeholder model is not strongly related to HR power. So by advocating stakeholder and employee concerns does not give HR executives the power as in Japan. So
we have these two ideal type models, the shareholder value model and the stakeholder model. And we found evidence for the existence of both models in the United States, which is consistent with the point I made earlier that some U.S. companies have a kind of Japanese flavor to them, which isn't surprising if you remember back in the 1980s how popular Japanese management techniques were here in the United States. And a lot of those ideas did take root inside some U.S. companies. At the same time, in the last 10 years, the Japanese have been adopting many ideas from the United States, shareholder value model ideas. What was most interesting, I think, was how those shareholder value ideas have not taken root quite so strongly in Japan as the Japanese ideas seem to have taken root here in the United States. And that's based on our statistical analysis, structural equation modeling, it's called, of our data. Of course, it may be that because we're looking at data from early in the 21st century, we haven't observed the process of Japan borrowing from the United States quite long enough for the emergence of a shareholder value model in Japan, whereas the U.S. borrowing from Japan goes all the way back to the early 1980s, so it's been about 25 years. So there's evidence in our study to support both the idea that Japan and the U.S. are moving toward each other and that it's a bi-directional convergence. It isn't just that Japan's becoming more like the United States. We're also becoming more like them. At the same time, the business systems and corporations in those two countries remain very different, and that supports a contention in the literature that there are distinctive varieties of capitalism in the world today.